June 1815. Near a quiet Belgian village called Waterloo, one of the most decisive battles in European history is about to unfold. On one side stands a man whose name had shaken the entire continent for over a decade. Napoleon Bonaparte. Once the ruler of much of Europe, the French emperor now faces what could be his final chance to reclaim power. Napoleon commands an army of roughly 73,000 soldiers and around 250 cannons. These troops include battle-hardened veterans who had followed him through years of victories across Europe. Despite earlier defeats in exile, many still believe in their emperor's brilliance on the battlefield. But Napoleon's enemies have formed a powerful alliance known as the Seventh Coalition. Leading one of the coalition armies is Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, commanding a diverse force made up of British, Dutch, Belgian, and Hanoverian troops. His army numbers around 70,000 men, supported by about 150 cannons. Meanwhile, another army is approaching from the east. It is led by the experienced Prussian general Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. His troops had already helped defeat Napoleon in earlier campaigns and now marched toward Waterloo with nearly 50,000 soldiers and over 130 cannons. Together, the coalition forces will greatly outnumber Napoleon. But timing is everything. Napoleon's strategy is simple but risky. Defeat Wellington quickly before the Prussians can arrive. If he can destroy the Allied army first, he might still turn the tide of the war. The night before the battle, however, nature itself interferes. Heavy rain pours across the battlefield. The ground becomes soaked and muddy. Cannons sink into the earth, horses struggle to move, and large troop formations become difficult to maneuver. Napoleon, known for his bold and rapid attacks, is forced to delay the battle. Hours pass. Finally, around midday on June 18th, 1815, the first cannon shots echo across the fields near Waterloo. The battle begins. Napoleon's opening move targets a strategic farmhouse called Hougoumont, positioned on the Allied right flank. Originally intended as a diversion to draw Allied forces away from the center, the attack quickly escalates into a brutal fight. French soldiers repeatedly attempt to capture the fortified farm, but the defenders hold their ground. The struggle becomes intense and chaotic. Muskets fire at close range. Buildings catch fire, soldiers fight among gardens, walls, and courtyards. What was supposed to be a simple distraction now consumes thousands of troops. Meanwhile, Napoleon prepares a larger assault against the center of Wellington's army. French artillery begins bombarding the Allied positions, followed by waves of infantry advancing uphill toward the ridge where Wellington's forces are stationed. The battle grows louder and more violent. Cannon smoke fills the air. Drums beat. Officers shout commands as soldiers struggle to maintain formation under relentless fire. At one moment, Allied cavalry launches a powerful counterattack against the advancing French infantry. The charge successfully pushes the French back and captures several cannons. But the victory comes at a cost. The Allied cavalry pursues too far and loses formation. Seizing the opportunity, the French cavalry counterattacks, cutting down many of the pursuing riders. The battlefield becomes a scene of chaos. Horses collapsing, cannons firing continuously, and wounded soldiers covering the muddy fields. Still, neither side gains a decisive advantage. As the battle continues, Marshal Michel Ney, one of Napoleon's most aggressive commanders, believes he sees signs that the Allied army is beginning to retreat. Acting quickly, Ney orders a massive cavalry charge against Wellington's center. Thousands of French cavalry riders surge forward across the battlefield. But something is wrong. The Allied infantry has not retreated. Instead, they form defensive squares. Tight formations of soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder with bayonets pointed outward. Without infantry or artillery support, the charging cavalry finds itself exposed. Musket fire erupts from every side. Cannons blast through the ranks. Wave after wave of cavalry attacks the squares, but the formations hold firm. The cost is devastating. By now, the battlefield is covered with fallen men and horses. And then, just as the fighting reaches its peak, a new threat appears on the horizon. Dark columns of troops begin to emerge in the distance. They are not French. They are Prussians. General Blücher's army has finally arrived. Napoleon now faces the worst possible situation. A two-front battle. The fate of Europe hangs in the balance. and the most dramatic moment of the battle is still yet to come. As the Battle of Waterloo raged on, the situation for Napoleon was becoming increasingly dangerous. The French army was still fighting fiercely against Wellington's forces, but the arrival of the Prussians threatened to change everything. In the distance, dark columns of soldiers could be seen marching toward the battlefield. These were the troops of General Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, who had pushed his exhausted army forward with incredible determination. Despite suffering heavy losses only days earlier, the Prussians were determined to join the fight and help defeat Napoleon once and for all. For Napoleon, this was the scenario he had hoped to avoid. His entire strategy had depended on defeating Wellington quickly before the Prussians could arrive. Now that window of opportunity was closing fast. At first, Napoleon attempted to contain the new threat by sending part of his army to slow the Prussian advance. French forces moved to defend the village of Plancenoit, a small but strategically important location on the French right flank. Soon, intense fighting erupted there. Prussian troops attacked repeatedly, trying to break through and reach Napoleon's rear. French soldiers fought desperately to hold the village, launching counterattacks and pushing the Prussians back several times. The streets of Plancenoit turned into a chaotic battlefield filled with smoke, rubble, and constant gunfire. Despite the fierce resistance, the Prussian pressure continued to grow. Meanwhile, the struggle between Napoleon and Wellington had reached its most critical phase. Throughout the afternoon, French infantry and artillery kept hammering the Allied center. Wellington's army had been fighting for hours under relentless attacks. Many units had already suffered heavy casualties, and the line was beginning to show signs of strain. Napoleon believed that one powerful final blow could still shatter the Allied defense. So he decided to commit his most elite and trusted soldiers, the legendary Imperial Guard. These troops were not ordinary soldiers. The Imperial Guard represented the finest veterans of Napoleon's army. Many of them had served in multiple campaigns and had earned a reputation for discipline, courage, and loyalty. For years, the Guard had been seen as nearly unbeatable on the battlefield. Their presence alone often terrified Napoleon's enemies. As evening approached, Napoleon gave the order. Columns of the Imperial Guard began advancing toward the Allied center. The soldiers marched steadily uphill, drums beating and officers shouting commands. Around them, cannon fire thundered and musket shots cracked through the smoke-filled air. For the French army watching behind them, the Guard represented hope, the last chance to turn defeat into victory. At first, the attack seemed promising. The Imperial Guard pushed forward with determination, forcing some Allied units to fall back. For a brief moment, it looked as if Napoleon's gamble might succeed. But Wellington had prepared carefully. Hidden behind the ridge were fresh Allied troops waiting for the right moment. As the Imperial Guard moved closer, these soldiers suddenly rose from their positions and unleashed a devastating volley of musket fire. The effect was immediate and shocking. The advancing French soldiers were hit by a storm of bullets. More volleys followed, each one tearing through the tightly packed formations of the Guard. Despite their discipline and bravery, the Imperial Guard could not break through the Allied line. For the first time in their history, they began to falter. Some units attempted to push forward again, but the heavy fire and growing pressure from the Prussians made the situation impossible to recover. Then the unthinkable happened. The Imperial Guard began to retreat. Across the battlefield, French soldiers saw the Guard falling back. For an army that had long believed in the invincibility of these elite troops, the sight was devastating. Morale collapsed. Panic spread through the ranks. At that moment, Wellington recognized that the time had come. He ordered a general advance. Allied infantry moved forward across the battlefield, while cavalry units pursued the retreating French soldiers. At the same time, the Prussian army intensified its attacks on Napoleon's right flank. The French army, exhausted and disorganized, could no longer hold its ground. What began as an orderly withdrawal quickly turned into a chaotic retreat. Prussian cavalry chased the fleeing soldiers deep into the night, capturing thousands and scattering what remained of Napoleon's once formidable army. Napoleon himself narrowly avoided capture. With only a small escort, he managed to escape the battlefield and retreat toward France. Behind him, the field of Waterloo was left covered with the terrible cost of the battle. Tens of thousands of soldiers had been killed or wounded in a single day of fighting. Later that evening, two of Napoleon's greatest opponents finally met on the battlefield. The Duke of Wellington and General Blücher congratulated each other on their victory. Together, they had ended the final campaign of Napoleon Bonaparte. But the consequences of Waterloo would reach far beyond the battlefield. The defeat would bring an end to an era that had shaped Europe for nearly 2 decades. The era of the Napoleonic Wars. And a new chapter in European history was about to begin. Although the Battle of Waterloo marked the end of Napoleon's ambitions, the story of Europe's changing balance of power had begun long before that dramatic day. One of the key players in this transformation was the Kingdom of Prussia, a state that rose from relative obscurity to become one of the most powerful forces in Europe. To understand how Prussia reached that position, we must look back several centuries. Originally, the Kingdom of Prussia was not a single unified territory. Instead, it consisted of 2 separate regions that gradually came together under one ruling dynasty. One of these regions was Brandenburg, a territory located within the Holy Roman Empire. For centuries, Brandenburg had been governed by the powerful Hohenzollern dynasty, a noble German family that would eventually play a major role in European politics. The other region was known simply as Prussia. Long before it became a powerful kingdom, this area was inhabited by Baltic tribes known as the Old Prussians. These people gave the region its name. During the Middle Ages, the territory came under the control of the Teutonic Order, a military and religious organization formed during the Crusades. The Teutonic Knights established a powerful state in the region, building fortified cities and spreading Christianity among the local populations. However, by the 16th century, the power of the Teutonic Order began to decline. In 1525, an important transformation took place. The Grand Master of the Order, Albert of the Hohenzollern family, decided to secularize the lands controlled by the Teutonic Knights. With the approval of the Polish king, he dissolved the religious state and established the Duchy of Prussia, turning it into a hereditary possession of his family. Over time, the Duchy of Prussia became closely connected with Brandenburg, which was also ruled by the Hohenzollern dynasty. This union created a growing political entity often referred to as Brandenburg Prussia. For many years, this state remained relatively modest in size and influence compared to the great European powers such as France, Austria, and Russia. That situation changed dramatically in the 18th century. In 1740, a young and ambitious ruler ascended the Prussian throne. Frederick II, later known to history as Frederick the Great. Frederick inherited a small but highly disciplined army created by his father. Unlike many rulers of his time, Frederick believed that military strength could transform Prussia into a major European power. Soon after taking the throne, he launched a bold and risky campaign. At the time, the powerful Habsburg monarchy ruled a large portion of Central Europe, including the wealthy province of Silesia. When Maria Theresa became the new ruler of Austria, her position was still unstable and many European leaders questioned her authority. Frederick saw an opportunity. In 1740, Prussian forces invaded Silesia, beginning what became known as the War of the Austrian Succession. Silesia was not just another territory. It was one of the richest and most economically important regions in Central Europe, filled with industry, agriculture, and valuable resources. Frederick knew that controlling this region would greatly strengthen Prussia. The gamble worked. After a series of intense battles, Prussia managed to secure most of Silesia in 1742, following the First Silesian War. But the conflict was not over. Soon afterward, a second Silesian War broke out as Austria attempted to regain the lost territory. Once again, the Prussian army proved its strength. In 1745, Prussian forces achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of Kesselsdorf, defeating the Austrian army and forcing Austria to accept Prussia's control of Silesia in the Treaty of Dresden. For Prussia, this was a turning point. The kingdom had suddenly gained a wealthy region that dramatically increased its population, resources, and influence. However, the struggle for power in Europe was far from finished. Only a decade later, another massive conflict erupted. The 7 Years' War, which began in 1756. This war would involve nearly every major European power, turning large parts of Europe into a battlefield. At the start of the war, Frederick made another bold move by occupying Saxony, hoping to secure a strategic advantage before his enemies could unite against him. But the situation quickly became dangerous. Prussia soon found itself surrounded by powerful enemies, including Austria, Russia, France, and Sweden. Fighting on multiple fronts, Frederick's army faced overwhelming pressure. Despite several brilliant victories, the Prussian army also suffered devastating setbacks. One of the most serious defeats came in 1759 at the Battle of Kunersdorf, where a combined Russian and Austrian force crushed Frederick's army. At that moment, Prussia seemed close to collapse. Many observers believed the kingdom would soon disappear from the map of Europe. But history took an unexpected turn. An event later remembered as the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. And that miracle would save Prussia from destruction. Just when it seemed that Prussia was on the verge of collapse during the 7 Years' War, an unexpected event completely changed the course of the conflict. In 1762, the Russian Empress Elizabeth Petrovna, one of Frederick the Great's most determined enemies, suddenly died. Her successor, Peter III, had a very different view of the war. In fact, he admired Frederick the Great and respected Prussia's military achievements. Almost immediately after taking the throne, Peter III decided to withdraw Russia from the war. Not only that, but he also made peace with Prussia and even offered support to Frederick. This sudden shift stunned the other powers fighting against Prussia. What had seemed like certain defeat suddenly turned into survival. Frederick was able to stabilize his position and continue resisting his remaining enemies. Eventually, the war came to an end in 1763 with the Treaty of Hubertusburg. Despite years of brutal fighting and enormous losses, Prussia managed to keep Silesia, the very territory that had triggered the war in the first place. The outcome had enormous consequences. Prussia had successfully defended itself against some of the strongest powers in Europe. Its army gained a reputation for discipline, innovation, and resilience. From that moment onward, Prussia was widely recognized as one of Europe's major powers. Frederick himself earned a permanent place in history and became known as Frederick the Great. But Frederick's influence was not limited to warfare. He was also known as a complex and unusual ruler. While he was a brilliant military strategist, he was also deeply interested in philosophy, music, and the arts. Frederick played the flute, wrote essays, and corresponded with famous Enlightenment thinkers such as Voltaire. Yet behind this intellectual side was a determined and sometimes ruthless leader who believed that the strength of the state depended on discipline and efficiency. During his reign, Prussia continued to expand its territory and influence. In 1772, Frederick played a key role in the First Partition of Poland, an agreement between Prussia, Austria, and Russia that divided parts of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth among them. Frederick's main goal was to strengthen Prussia's position in Central Europe. Through this agreement, Prussia gained territory that connected its previously separated lands, linking Brandenburg with East Prussia. This geographic connection was extremely important for the kingdom's political and economic development. Frederick also became involved in the War of the Bavarian Succession, where he opposed attempts by Austria to expand its influence in southern Germany. Through careful diplomacy and military pressure, he managed to maintain the balance of power within the German states. By the time Frederick the Great died in 1786, Prussia had transformed dramatically. When he first took the throne, Prussia had been a relatively small and vulnerable kingdom. By the end of his reign, it had doubled in size and possessed one of the most disciplined armies in Europe. However, the strength of the Prussian state relied heavily on Frederick's personal leadership. After his death, this became a serious problem. Frederick left no children, and the throne passed to his nephew, Frederick William II. Unlike his famous uncle, the new king lacked the same strategic vision and determination. Although Prussia continued to gain territory during his reign, the government gradually became less efficient, and the army lost some of its earlier discipline. During this period, Prussia also took part in the Second and Third Partitions of Poland, which eventually erased the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth from the map of Europe. While these territorial gains made Prussia larger, they also stretched the kingdom's resources and distracted its leaders from emerging dangers. One of those dangers was rising rapidly in Western Europe. In France, the French Revolution had begun to reshape politics and society. Revolutionary ideas spread across the continent, and the old system of monarchies and alliances started to crumble. At first, Prussia joined coalitions against revolutionary France. But its leadership was often indecisive, and its attention remained focused on territorial ambitions elsewhere. This hesitation would prove to be a costly mistake, because out of the chaos of revolutionary France emerged a brilliant and ambitious military commander. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Within a few years, Napoleon would conquer much of Europe and challenge every major power on the continent, including Prussia. The once feared Prussian army, which had gained its legendary reputation under Frederick the Great, would soon face one of the greatest military challenges in its history, and the coming conflict would reshape the future of Europe once again. The road that eventually led to Waterloo was not just the story of Napoleon's rise and fall. It was also the story of how Prussia transformed itself from a struggling kingdom into a rising power. A power that would later play a decisive role in the unification of Germany and the balance of European politics for generations to come. But that transformation was only beginning.